Welcome to online class, take two, hooray! So I've made some adjustments to the PowerPoint. Hopefully it will help you guys follow along a little better. I'm not going to use the pen anymore. I'm going to try to use new slides that have the areas highlighted that I'm talking about. Hopefully you have read chapter 4 already. We're going to be talking about illustrated manuscripts. I'm also going to try to say a lot less because I know that it's hard to listen to when you're sitting and listening to my lectures. I'm also going to try to slow down. So we'll talk about this more in class. There's a nut. But let's get started on chapter 4. So we're going to be talking about illustrated manuscripts. You'll need to know this for your quiz. The term illustrated manuscript is used because they would use a gold leaf on a lot of these books pages that would reflect light, and it would make it look like these books were being illuminated. Illuminated manuscripts are something that are very prestigious, very wanted, and very special in this time. It was something that was very, very painstakingly created, and they would use the best materials almost all of the time. And so they got this name, illustrated manuscripts, because of the way the gold leaf that they often use in these books would reflect light. It would make it look like it was glowing. They're also referred to as illuminated manuscripts. So in modern day, the term illuminated manuscript is used to describe all decorative and illustrated handwritten books that were produced from the late Roman Empire until printed books replaced the art form. At the end of this chapter, we'll start talking about movable type, kind of coming in and getting rid of all of this beautiful way we used to make books. But for now, let's jump into talking about how illustrated or illuminated manuscripts were created. In this specific art form, the visual embellishment was extremely important. It was something they relied on to communicate both the ideas, but also the importance of the ideas that they were conveying. They were created with extreme care and intentional design sensitivity. Manuscripts were extremely costly. They were really expensive to make. They were really expensive to buy. They were something that really only kings would have, only very high noble people could have. At times, it would take the skin of over 300 sheep to make one book. Remember last class when we talked about vellum, the type of paper that was made from the skin of unbored sheep calves? Sometimes it would take 300 sheep to make one single book. So you'd have to raise a herd of sheep to create one of these illuminated manuscripts. A lot of times they would use gold or silver mixed with paint. They would use a lot of very rare minerals and materials to create very colorful and bright illustrations in these books. The majority of the covers of these books are covered with gold and silver and jewels. I went to Turkey and got to see one in person, and it was covered with rare gems, and it was absolutely beautiful. It looked like a prop out of a movie. So let's keep moving on. We're going to talk a little bit about illustrated manuscripts in a broad sense and learn a couple terms. So here are the terms we're going to be talking about real quick. These are the outline of where an illuminated manuscript would be created. All illuminated manuscripts were created in a scriptoria. A scriptoria is basically a writing room. It'd be known as a writing room. This is a place where they would create illustrated manuscripts, where books were made. They didn't have a printing press back then, so every single detail, every single letter, every single illustration had to be done painstakingly by hand. Now, there are a couple different roles within the scriptoria that created these books. The first we're going to talk about is the scritori. So the scritori is kind of the head of the writing room. He would function as an editor and an art director, and he would have to know both Greek and Latin. The scritori was kind of the highest, one of the most regarded positions at the time. If you were a scritori and you were the head of a scriptoria, you were making it in life. That was the equivalent of being the head of a giant marketing agency or the head of a giant print press. So the next person down is the copisti. The copisti is the letterer. So the copisti is the person who would hand letter each and every letter of the book. They would write every letter and make sure that it is absolutely perfect. If they made a spelling error, they couldn't erase it. They had to either tear that page out and start over or create a whole new book from scratch. The next role was the illuminator. The illuminator is basically a modern day illustrator. He would create supporting, striking visuals that would support the text. Something that's interesting to note about illuminated manuscripts was that they didn't focus on the image. Illuminated manuscripts focused on the content. I'm sorry, I totally got that backwards. Illuminated manuscripts focused solely on the illustration. All right, we're going to try this over. I am all kinds of tongue-tied. The scritori would show where the illustrations would be placed around the text. So the text was always at the forefront of these works. An illuminated manuscript was focused on the text. The text was laid out first, and then an illustration was made to accompany that so that the written word really got a chance to stand out, and the images that were portrayed were kind of support to what the written word was. So one more time, because I messed it up so many times. The illustrations were placed around the text. So the text was always planned out first, and it was the most important part of any kind of illustrated manuscript. So then another term we're going to talk about is the colophon. I haven't put it up here, but it's C-O-L-O-P-H-O-N. The colophon was an inscription that's always at the end of the book. If you look at any of the yearbooks at CBU, they always have a colophon in the back. And a colophon is basically a letter from the workers of the scriptoria to whoever is reading their work. These are a couple examples of how hard it was to work in one of these scriptorias and what the scriptori had written in the end at the colophon, describing the process of making that specific illustrated manuscript. As the sailor longs for a safe haven at the end of his voyage, so does the writer for the last word. They hated working in these places. Even though it was something that was highly regarded and special, it was hard. It was dark and damp and just really, really hard to sit there and letter after letter after letter after letter until the book was completed. Another scriptori said this: writing dims your eyes, makes your back ache, and knits your chest and stomach together. So think about sitting at a desk for 20 hours a day, writing letter after letter. Eventually, it would start to not be great. So that was a little note that they would add in the end in the colophon. Now, we talked about the illustrations. They weren't just for decorations. They were very, very intentional. They knew the illustrations could help benefit and help show visual communication. But again, the focus was always on the letters. Because of the kind of regional isolation at this time, it was really hard to travel, and innovation and different influences spread very, very slowly. This, fortunately for us, gives us some specific design styles to look at with illustrated manuscripts. So the first one that we're going to look at is the style of the classical style. So the classical style was used by the Greeks and Romans when they designed their illustrated manuscripts. A lot of these didn't survive. There was a huge fire at a Greek library in Alexandria that was known to contain most of the illustrated manuscripts that are done in this classical style, and it burned to the ground along with several hundred of these scrolls. But from what's been found, this style can be visually identified by a couple things. So the classical style is almost like a modern day comic book. Its layout of the text and the layout of the small illustrations would be very much like a comic book does today. You'd see here that we would have the text at the top supporting whatever the illustration is at the bottom and kind of explaining the overall piece almost like you would read a comic book. You read what the characters are saying, you read what's happening in the scene, and then you look at the picture that is describing that. Also, it was laid out in these very symmetrical blocks, like you see here, and these blocks would kind of give way to a specific style so that we can identify the classical style and kind of call it that comic book look. The invention of parchment allowed for the designs in this style to become much more complex. The illustrations became much more detailed and much more visually communicative of what they were trying to say. So, following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, there was an era known as the medieval era. Advances in written communication were brought to a near halt. It was a very dark time, and almost no advancement took place during this time. During this era of time, the majority of the population became extremely illiterate and extremely superstitious. But just because this time was known as the Dark Ages doesn't mean that the designs and illustrations were dark as well. It's actually the opposite. So during the Dark Ages, almost all of the work was rich and bright and had these bold, colorful, kind of crazy illustrations to go along in these illustrated manuscripts. That's going to be on your quiz, by the way, that during the Dark Ages, the colors were bright, bold, and the illustrations were very detailed. One of the only things that kept the written word alive during this time in this style of the illuminated manuscripts was the Christian belief of sacred writings. A lot of illustrated manuscripts are either passages from the Bible or books from the Bible or stories from the Bible that people wanted to keep alive and keep interpreting, and that during the time of the medieval era when people were becoming very illiterate and superstitious, even though they were illiterate, they wanted to keep Bible stories alive. So as the classical style began to evolve and evolved even more, they started to create their own way of lettering. It wasn't a new alphabet, but it was a new way of creating and writing those symbols and those letters. It was based entirely on creating a simpler and faster way to write. They would be trying to write these huge, long books, and they really just wanted to find a way that they could do it faster and easier. So there were two different styles that emerged in the classical style. The first is the uncial. The uncial was written between two guidelines that were set 1 inch apart. You can see that at the top on this slide. That is the Roman uncial. Roman uncial is to where all of the characters would be the same size. There would be two lines, one on the bottom and one on the top, that would be 1 inch apart from each other, and all the letters would be written within that line. The uncial was very, very easy to write letters with. Now the second one was the semi-uncial. And the semi-uncial, seen at the bottom here, was something that was much faster to write. Instead of being written between 2 lines, it was written between 4 lines. If you've been in elementary school, you've seen as you're learning letters, you'll learn on a semi-uncial. There'll be a line at the bottom, a line in the middle, another line a little bit higher, and then a line at the top to show you how to create letters. So working on a 4-line system, the semi-uncial, allowed for them to create ascenders and descenders. So an ascender is a part of a letter that comes above the line, and a descender is a part of the letter that goes below the line, as you can see here. So ascenders and descenders started to appear in this semi-uncial kind of quick way of writing, and this is really how we started to develop lowercase letters. Eventually would evolve into a new system of lowercase letters that had the same sounds, had the same meaning, but were different symbols that were kind of a shorthand of the symbols that were happening up at the top. So the next style we're going to talk about is the Celtic book design. So the Celtic book design has a very, very, very unique and recognizable style. a little bit of history. During the medieval era, there were a lot of hordes of German barbarians that didn't invade the area of Ireland. There was a lot of conflict going on, but the Celtic people lived in isolation and peace. So that's why their style is so different. Uh, During this time, there were some large crusades happening in the area, and the Celts were being rapidly brought over to Christianity. This allowed the Celtic style and traditions to work their way into illustrated manuscripts and religious texts that were trying to be kept alive at the time. So the Celtic design style can be identified by a couple things. Uh, Abstract and extremely complex geometric linear patterns, and a lot of weaves, twists, and ornaments that kind of fill the space with bright textures. As you can see on this image, the border that's going around is a very, very clear example of the Celtic style. A lot of geometric line patterns that are often weaving and twisting together. So the bright colors of the Celtic style were a huge contrast to what was happening in the scriptoria. Scriptorias were often very dark and dreary, and it was a hard job. But the Celtic design really wanted to bring color and brightness into these and started to introduce their own style. Their ornaments were used in three ways, and you'll need to know this for your quiz. They would use it as frames or borders, which we see here on this image. They would use it on the opening page of each gospel, which we'll look at in just a second, and they would create full designed pages with these ornaments called carpet pages because they resembled kind of oriental rugs. So this would be an example of the first page of Matthew. So this is in the Celtic style. As you can see, the ornaments, the weaving, all of the different elements are here of that style. And this would be a carpet page. It's very ornate, looks like a carpet, a Middle Eastern kind of complex rug. And one of the biggest contributions that they gave, the Celtic style gave, was the addition of a space between words so that you could string together letters to create words more clearly. Before, the letters would kind of just be strung out as they went, and you would figure out where one word ended and the next one started. The Celtic style put a space in between so you could easily read the words. Now, the Celtic style kind of got out of hand. As they wanted to get more complex and make things more beautiful, they really wanted to show these beautiful ornaments. And a way to do that is they would make the first letter on the page very large and very complex. And eventually, the letters got so large they were taking up almost half the page, or on this carpet page, almost all of the page, with only 3 letters. So, as they kind of grew, it created this very, very distinct style that as a page started, that whatever was the most important, that first letter would be broad and huge and with all these different ornaments and bright colors to kind of accentuate how important it was. The Celtic school and the style of this manuscript ended abruptly in 795 when the first raiders kind of came into Ireland and really got rid of this style. There were a lot of illustrated and illuminated manuscripts that were being worked on that were never finished or were destroyed and never completed. The next style we're going to talk about is the Caroline Graphic Renewal. So the Caroline Graphic Renewal happened when Charlemagne became the ruler in 800. This time was known as the Holy Roman Empire. And although it's rumored that Charlemagne was completely illiterate, he couldn't read, he was really, really responsible for a huge revival of the arts. By this time, like we said in the medieval era, it was a time that people hadn't been wanting to read, hadn't been literate. It hadn't been something that was important in culture. And so Charlemagne really turned that around and created a revival for the arts. Many manuscripts had been sloppy, had been not drawn very well. It wasn't a way, or it wasn't very unified. It's something that had kind of fallen to the back seat. But Charlemagne ordered for the books to be standardized and recreated. He wanted them to look good, and he wanted them to look almost identical in the style. So page layout was standardized that drew from a Celtic style, but used the semi-uncial, where we get our lowercase letters. Remember we talked about that? So it had ascenders and descenders, and that really locked in our lowercase alphabet. So Charlemagne is kind of responsible for bringing back the semi-uncial and using those lowercase letters as kind of the standard for illustrated manuscripts during this time. So the reason it became a standard is because it was extremely easy to write and it was very, very legible to read. Instead of trying to read things in all caps, you could very easily see what words went where the spaces were. The ascenders and descenders helped you clarify what letters were what letters, and it became the standard in Europe. You'll need to know that for your quiz. That's why it has a star next to it. So moving on, we're going to talk about Spanish pictorial expressionism. It's a lot of big words. We'll break it down here. There were some people that lived in the European mountains, some groups of people, and because of their isolation, they didn't buy into the Caroline graphic style. They didn't buy into that kind of standard that Charlemagne set of using the lowercase letters in that semi-uncial, and so they had their own unique style. This Spanish pictorial expressionism is identified by this: flat shapes of intense color. So there was almost no dimension, but there was intense, bright colors happening in these illuminated manuscripts. A lot of times they'd use stars, garlands, polygons, and it would never have any kind of depth to it. It would always be very flat and bold. A lot of times they would add a border around the whole illustration to kind of give it a nice decoration to make it look a little more chiseled. So something you'll need to know for your quiz is that Spanish pictorial expressionism deals almost exclusively with the book of Revelation. They loved illustrating Revelation because it was so fantastical. They always wanted to create something that was bright, bold, and kind of on the edge, and Revelation was a great book for them to do that. A lot of times you'll see illustrations of the dragon beast that's in Revelation, or like this, angels pouring out seals onto the earth. So a lot of the illustrations of this time were created from the book of Revelation. Eventually, these people that lived in these kind of mountainous regions started to get in and started to use the Caroline graphic renewal style that Charlemagne had set, and this idea of Spanish pictorial expressionism kind of faded away into the background. The next style we're going to talk about are the Romanesque and Gothic manuscripts. The Romanesque period was from 1000 to 1150. This was a time of a renewed religious fervor. It was a time when people wanted copies of the Bible. They wanted religious texts. They wanted to learn. And so the written word, and especially these illuminated manuscripts, became extremely important. This was a time when a ton of new scriptoria were founded, and a lot of people were trying to make illuminated manuscripts. The illustrations in these were less concerned about looking real and having depth, and more about incorporating the gold or the pattern textures to make them look more opulent. Because of the Dark Ages, it had kind of faded away. This is really the renewal and the height of illuminated manuscripts. There was another kind of cultural shift to where villages and cities grew, and trade and commerce and politics started to grow as well. During the late 1200s, because of this shift, there was a lot of universities opening up. Now, if we have universities, we all know what that means. We need books. So people needed books to learn from. There's a hunger for knowledge, and they wanted to learn from these universities, but they needed books to learn from. So a lot of these books were commissioned and ended up being illuminated manuscripts. During this time, there was also a huge passion for illustrating the book of Revelation again. And there was a huge interest in the Romanesque style in illustrating the apocalypse. So something we need to know for your quiz, it's on the right here, is there was a specific Gothic style that was used in these Romanesque or Gothic manuscripts. It was a style called textura. Now, textura style is named that because it almost looks like a white picket fence. If you look at it, they would lay down all of the vertical strokes first and then connect the horizontal strokes. You'll see that every vertical stroke is about the same. It has the same bottom, has the same top, has the same kind of vertical stroke. And this would be a way of saving space. So the textura style became extremely popular because it saved a ton of space on parchment. They could map out all the vertical lines of the letters and then connect the horizontals and be able to fit a lot more text on a page than they had previously. So the second to last, the really last style that we're going to talk about is the Islamic manuscripts. So the Islamic manuscript is identified by its elaborate letter forms and extremely intricate geometric designs. They were often very abstract and again, very, very geometric. Something that's interesting about the Islamic manuscripts, they would always use bright color and extreme complexity to make up for the fact that they didn't have any illustrations. Now, the reason there are no illustrations in Islamic manuscripts is because at the time they believed that no man could create life, that only God was responsible for creating life. So to them, creating an illustration of a man or creating an illustration of an animal was almost like the artist was trying to create life, and it was frowned upon because that was something that only God could do. They would almost never create literal representations of living creatures. So if you look at an Islamic manuscript, you'll usually see that it is very bold in color, very bright, and extremely complex, but will usually not depict men or animals or any kind of living thing. So as we transitioned, we're going to kind of in a middle point from the medieval era to the European Renaissance, illustrated manuscripts became more important. During the medieval era, we talked about people were illiterate, it wasn't important, it wasn't something special, and illustrated manuscripts started to come into a new level of importance during the European Renaissance. A lot of works from this time kind of moved away from wanting to be abstract and have a certain style and started to be more concerned with realism. They wanted to show depth. They wanted to show the illusion of the illustration actually taking place instead of focusing on the bright colors or the flat kind of planes of color that we talked about in Spanish pictorialism. But unfortunately, near the end of this era, woodblock printing started to come into Europe. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit more next class in person. And the production of handmade illustrated manuscripts continued, but it was ultimately doomed by the fully typographic book. And the fully typographic book was made so easy by movable type. And eventually that spoke to the end of these illustrated manuscripts. So thanks for watching. This is the end of our lecture. I put a link up on Blackboard to BMD Designs. He's a great example of kind of hand lettering and does some really, really great illustrations all by hand that really kind of look back to this idea of creating an illustrated manuscript. The idea I really want you to look at here is that sometimes it takes time and effort and a kind of specific attention to detail to create something that is truly, truly beautiful. So hopefully I will see you guys in class next week, and hopefully you enjoyed this lecture this week. Have a great week. Bye-bye.